Preload is all about setting the height of the spring and making up for the difference between the length of the shock and the length of the spring. It's also used for setting the height of the vehicle off the ground or the ride height. Now in this case I've got a big problem here, but that can be made up for by using what's called a preload spacer or preload clip. Here's one here. Now most vehicles come with a set of these in different lengths, so they should be pretty much free for you. And you just clip it over the body of the shock like this, and we get another one. And there we go. And now suddenly this spring fits. Now there are different ways that you can set preload depending upon the design of the shock. Here I have a smaller on-road shock which has an adjustable preload via a ring. See, there's threads that go around the outside of the shock cylinder, and just by turning it I'm actually adding the space here. So I'm adding preload, turning it the other way. I've reduced the preload, and you can start to see already that this is a rather short spring, just like the last one I was showing you on the off-road shock. Fix that just by setting the preload. This type of shock is called a threaded shock or threaded body shock because there are threads like a screw on the outside of it. Now here's a different type of preload adjustment. This one has a collar on it that's tightened by a screw, and just by loosening that screw you can pull that whole collar down, and there you go. Preload has been added. Takes up all the extra slack. Now back to the cutaway truck. Now this one has the same type of shocks that have the preload clips or preload spacers on them that you can pull off and put back on. Over on the right hand side I've got the exact same amount of spacing as on the left, but I've done it with 4 different thicknesses of spacers. So they come in different thicknesses, and here's a really thin one compared to on the other side where I've just used one single thicker one. I personally like shocks that use these preload clips because when you put one on you know that that's the exact amount of space that you're adding. You put the exact same clip on both sides or the same set of clips and you know you're getting the same thing. Compared to with these more expensive threaded body shocks, which a lot of people like to use because they give you more adjustability. But it's a little bit harder to get the exact same adjustment from one shock to the next. You have to put them side by side and compare them, or use a pair of calipers to measure the distance in there. Compared to with these clips, like I said, you just put one on and you know that that's exactly the amount of spacing that you've got. Now I'm going to go ahead and take all the clips off on this truck. Now see where it sits. See how the whole truck is really sagging down in the center? It's just sitting way too low. To set this up properly, at the very least, you need enough preload to make up for the space right there. The reason for that, going back to the original shock here, like I said before, if you don't have enough spacing on there, the spring will just move around haphazardly and it can get out of whack. In this case I'm just going to add a medium-sized spacer to each side. Same thing on both sides. Now with the suspension extended, that's about right. Or at least it's the minimum that you need. But still, honestly, looking at where the truck sits, the arms are still kind of angled down and it's sagging in the center a little bit. So when you have an issue like this where your vehicle is sitting lower than you want it to be, just add preload. In this case I'm just going to take out these medium-sized ones and add in some large ones. Never be afraid to experiment with spring preload clips. They're cheap and it's obviously easy to swap them out. It's just a good way to set your ride height where you want it to be. Another thing that you can do is change out the length of the spring using the same stiffness of spring, just something longer, It's going to have almost the same effect as just adding spring preload clips. Now there's a myth. A lot of people think that adding preload is going to stiffen up your spring. As long as you're not using springs that are way too long, that's just a myth. Let me show you exactly what I mean. I'm going to use this same shock again, but springs that are much longer. So you can see here that this spring goes below the bottom of the shaft, and I don't even have any preload on here. So when I put the lower spring retainer on, the spring is already pre-compressed. And you can see here in slow motion, I'm having to actually compress the spring before the spring retainer will fit on. There's absolutely no space left up here at the top, and there's already tension in this spring. So now any spring preload that you add is actually adding even more tension to the spring. Because you've compressed the spring a little bit here already, just add another one on for effect. This is basically making the spring effectively stiffer. The more you compress a coil spring, the more force it's going to be exerting back against the suspension. So this is the one case where that common misconception is actually correct, where using a spring that's too long for the shock, such that as soon as it's installed with no preloads at all, it's already compressed, then adding preload spacers or adjusting your preload down with this sort of spring will make the spring stiffer. But there are other problems that you already have from having a spring pre-compressed. For one, obviously there's no way that you can reduce the preload. And there's also no way that you can reduce the ride height of the vehicle if you already have no preloads. Also, if the spring is already so long that it's compressing itself just to install it, the vehicle may always be like this, with the suspension fully extended. So when you put it down on the ground, it's just going to sit just like that. No compression whatsoever. When you have springs set up properly on a vehicle, when you set the vehicle down, it should compress the spring very slightly on its own. That's going to give you the ability for the suspension to both compress farther as you go over bumps or if you land a jump, and to extend a little bit. So if you go over the opposite of a bump, a little dip, then the wheel will be able to extend down into that dip and come back. And you'll be able to maintain better traction between the tire and the ground.